Good morning, everybody. My name is Jacco van der Sluis, and welcome to this webinar on truck platooning from HEADSTART. Today we will have Alvaro Aru from IDIADA also presenting, and Chef van Montfort, a colleague of mine, also in the same room as me. And if you go to the next slide, please. This will be the agenda for today. If you look at the first bullet, introduction, that is where we are now, of course. After my introduction, Alvaro will take over with a general introduction of HEADSTART. And after that, Chef will take over the session and present the rest of the agenda. So he will start with the HEADSTART methods we use, and that will be a short recap of yesterday's webinar. So hopefully some of you are already familiar with it. If not, we will do just a short coverage of that topic. After that, the truck platooning use case will be introduced, and that will be the main part of the webinar for today. So we will shortly explain the truck platooning use case, also how we see it in the HEADSTART project. And after that, we want to apply the HEADSTART method to truck platooning. So we will talk about scenario selections and allocation, testing of scenarios, and also evaluations. We will end with a wrap-up, and also we will have some time available to answer further questions. If you look at the process we want to use during this webinar, for your information, everything is being recorded, and also all the slides will be published on our website. During this webinar, we are using the Slido tool, so you see the website. So please, for all participants, go to that website and log in using HEADSTART, because we will use that tool for gathering your questions, so you can give your questions there. And we will also use the tool as a way to raise our own questions. So we will use it for polls, and we will show that also during the presentation. So we will switch between slides and the Slido tool, so we can see the questions. Yes. So I think this is also very important for us as organizers. We want to really gather the feedback of the experts. So what are we doing from HEADSTART for the use case truck platooning? Are we using the good methods? Are we not missing anything? So we really want to gather feedback from the expert using this Slido tool also. But also we want to use your feedback to improve deliverables, and that we know that we have really a validated approach. So we will use your feedback in the deliverable 2.3 related to the assessment methods for the different use cases in HEADSTART. This webinar will pay special attention to the key enabling technologies, communication, V2X, and positioning. The third cat in this project is cybersecurity, but for that we really have a dedicated webinar this Friday. Okay, so that was just a short introduction. The introduction of the project will be done by Alvaro. So, thank you.
Thank you very much, Jacco, for the introduction. And let me show you some slides about the HEADSTART project. harmonized European solutions for testing automated road transport. 1 second, please. Okay, it's working. Oops. There we are. So the HEADSTART project, it's the project that originally was granted from the call from the European Commission, former ART01 in 2018. It's a research and innovation action, and we started the 1st of January of 2019. So we are currently very close to our to the middle of the project. Okay, with a budget of 6 million euros, funded by European Commission. We are 17 partners involved in this activity. Just wanted to remind you that, and was already said, but I will make this to highlight this. Please follow us. Please visit our website. Please follow us on social media, and you will get all the different updates we have on the project, as well as information from this webinar and information from our work during the project. To give you a glimpse of who we are, this is the HEADSTART consortium in a nutshell. It's important to highlight that all this consortium was built to bring together all the different leaders on initiatives or projects that are dealing with connected automated driving validation. So, for instance, today is a good example. TNO is also the coordinator of the Ensemble project, which is a project that is the flagship project for truck platooning here in Europe. We've got people also from Germany that are involved in national projects like Pegasus, or the new ones, verification and validation, and set level 4 to 5, or in Vedecom in France, which are also leading important projects in the area of validation of automated vehicles, like the MOVE, or newer ones like SAM project. Also, would like to say that we have different kinds of memberships. For example, we've got technical services for type approval. That would be the case of RTW or A+ IDIADA. Euro NCAP accredited laboratories like TNO, BAST, or A+ IDIADA. And we have also the industry involved in this area. In the particular case, for example, of ICCS, they're also the coordinators of ICT4CART, which is another of the H2020 projects on the family of ART. Moving on, what are the objectives of HEADSTART? So our main vision is to define testing and validation procedures of connected and automated driving functions. But we are also taking into account what we call the key inherent technologies that were already introduced by Jaco, which for us are communications, cybersecurity, and positioning. We will cross-link all different test instances. This includes simulation, proving ground testing, and also going outside to the real world in order to validate safety and security performance according to the needs of what we understand are the users of these methodologies and procedures. From one side, the industry, the technology developers. This includes the industry, this includes the academia. For the other hand, on the other side, we have consumer testing, which in the particular case of Europe, is better known as Euro NCAP, and type approval, which of course each regulation, homologation in some countries to put a vehicle into the market. Just want to highlight, we are not making Euro NCAP protocols. We are not making new regulation. It's not our purpose. We are a research and development project, but we are there to pull the pieces, the building blocks necessary to enable these protocols, these new regulations with a technical basis on its back. And how we will do this? Well, we have 5 phases, 5 stages within this project. The first 2 ones are more advanced, are closely to be finished, which is what we call the identification phase, in which what we have done is to understand what's going on, what is the state of the art in a very dynamic concept as automated driving. Second one is harmonization. We've once known what is going on there, and in dialogue with those stakeholders, what are the approaches that we are here that there are in the market? What are the gaps between these approaches where there is overlap? We want, and this is one of our mottos in this project, to avoid fragmentation. We know there are a lot of initiatives that are taking care of testing, but from our side, a very critical thing is to avoid this fragmentation, minimize the fragmentation between the different initiatives. We are currently entering our third stage, which is definition and development. So from what we learned, from what we discussed, we go into the proper technical development and implementation of the validation procedures, which will be used in our phase 4 for demonstration. So we have chosen some use cases like the one that is presented today, and we will demonstrate let me explain that way, we want to validate our validation methodology. Let's say it in a nutshell, okay? In transversal to the whole project, we have a fifth phase, which we call the reach consensus. And this one is led by our expert group. We are being creating, and we will continue creating an expert group of stakeholders on the validation community or that are in need of validation. And a good example of what we're doing is this HEADSTART week, in which we have these different webinars in which we explain what we are doing, and we are asking you directly what would be needed, okay? 1 second. There should be okay, there we are. In a concept, in a nutshell, I don't want to go into details in each of these steps, but just saying that we're following this approach in the timeline in which we are including what would be the key enabling technologies within a scenario definition in order to be following a scenario-based validation methodology. Today, we'll speak about the qualification of scenarios. Today, we'll speak about the different test instances that are required and how to optimize these test instances. And we'll also be speaking about the evaluation of results. Okay, so as you can see, we have this schedule, this timeline, and would be the concept of the methodology. You will know more about this later. Just wanted to say a few things regarding the expert group. This expert group we created within the project has different webinars, meetings, telcos, and physical workshops when they were available, and they will be back again. But just wanted to let you know that we break them out into 6 different subgroups. The first 3, as you will see, are cybersecurity and communications and positioning. These are dealing with our key enabling technologies. The following 3, scenario selection, consumer testing, and type approval, are more focused on the specifics of these requirements. Okay. Once again, I would like to highlight that we joining this expert group, you will be able to participate. You will be able to first get the results of what we are doing, what is our current progress, and will also enable us to make a dialogue like today to get your feedback, to get your needs, so they can be incorporated into our work within the project. We have another column there, joint testing action. Well, this would be a joint cooperation between HEADSTART and the project. You are in a project, research project, or initiative, and you would like to use the HEADSTART methodology, please contact us and we can speak about how to do this. And just to give a glimpse of where we are, as we said, very close to month 18, these are all the technical deliverables that have already been finished by the consortium. Some of them can already be found on our webpage. 2 of them will be uploaded very shortly. So please come in, and just to remind you that we are in the second of our series of webinars. Today is track platooning. On Thursday, we will have traffic jam. And on Friday, we'll have this special webinar on cybersecurity, okay? On how cybersecurity, which is a very important issue, should be tackled within a scenario-based validation methodology. And that's from my side. Thank you very much for the opportunity, and just wanted to remind you that the slides will be shared, okay? So don't worry about that. And please, Jeff, the floor is yours. Thank you for this time.
Thank you, Alvaro. Yeah, so I have made some slides first on the general methodology of HEADSTART. This is an extreme recap of what was presented yesterday, where we have had a more extensive webinar on the HEADSTART methodology that will also be shared on the website. So if you want to know more about the methodology and the steps in between, please have a look there. The current webinar is mainly on what does it mean if we apply this method to, in this case, the use case truck platooning. But if we look at the methodology, we see 4 main steps where we start with input data, getting some kind of data collection. Because it is a scenario-driven database, a scenario-driven assessment method, the scenario database is a very important step there. Based on this scenario database, we can do testing. It will be discussed in a bit more detail in different types, as mentioned, proving ground, simulation, virtual testing. And then, of course, based on these test results, there will be, you need to do the evaluation of the test. So these are the main blocks in the overall methodology. If we then look at a more detailed one that we created in HEADSTART, so assuming that there is a database, that's good to keep in mind. So we do not intend to make a database or to generate this database, but it's assumed that there is a database. We only describe what should be in such a database and what, for example, is missing. Later on, we have also some dedicated questions related to that. So the next step is indeed to have, when you have this database, based on the information that you know from your driving function and the use case, you can select the relevant scenarios and the corresponding stochastic variations that are going with that driving function and specific use case. You can make concrete scenarios. Depending on how full that information is, it might be needed that, especially related to the cats that we're looking at, the HEADSTART cats, so communication, positioning and cybersecurity information needs to be added before we go into the next step where we have the allocation of the scenarios in order to do testing, where we then have the different types of testing. We have the 3 different types of testing, but that are, let's say, in a controlled environment, so virtual XL, so X in the loop, and proving ground testing. But we also definitely see a place there for field testing, which is a bit less controlled, but definitely is part of the whole testing scheme. Then as a last step, we have the evaluation, where, of course, based on the test results, but also based on the information that comes from the use cases, the evaluation can take place. What's also good to keep in mind is that this evaluation is also used to further provide input to the database and the selection of relevant scenarios, because that information, that what you have learned, you can reuse. So that was really the HEADSTART method in an extreme nutshell. The steps will be discussed later on in a bit more detail. So now about truck platooning. First a bit on HEADSTART. We looked in the work package 1 at different use cases and ranked them. At that time we looked at 5 different use cases: truck platooning, highway pilot, traffic jam, chauffeur, valet parking, and urban automated shuttles. There was already in the later phase, we made a selection of this. The rating was done looking at the different components, for example, to what extent are our HEADSTART cats in, but also the different types of testing are related to this, and of course also to the key user groups. What do they think about these kind of use cases? So based on that, we made a ranking. In the last few months, we made a selection of 3 of those to ensure that we cover all the different topics that we would like to cover. We made a reduced selection, which includes now truck platooning, highway pilot, and traffic jam chauffeur, where today we will discuss truck platooning. In the session on Thursday will be about traffic jam chauffeur. So then, purely looking at truck platooning. So To us, truck platooning refers to where two or more cooperative trucks drive together in a line, where we believe that maintaining a close distance enabled by V2V communication is an essential component of truck platooning. Because we already describe it as being driving close together, which is enabled by the V2V communication, I think it's clear to everyone that the communication is a very essential component. Also, if you look to safety critical topics and the safety criticality of that, because there is an interaction of the trucks. So the trucks interact on each other, and it's not that it's a single direction, but it's a multi-directional communication and an interaction. So that's, in that sense, communication is a very, very important key enabling technology if you look at truck platooning. Of course, also positioning is very relevant because you need to know where you are, but also, for example, you need to know where you are in a sense that you need to know what the driving rules are, but also think about what happens if you would like to cross a border. So if you need to cross a border with a truck platoon, what are the different rules? It might be that another country has it. So also in that sense, positioning is a very important key enabling technology. Within HEADSTART, we defined kind of three main stakeholder groups, the OEMs and tiers, so kind of the industry, type approval authorities, and we also defined consumer organizations, where we believe that for truck platooning, especially at this moment, consumer organizations are not that relevant because there is no consumer organization that really looks into trucks, let alone truck platooning. Later on, we also have a question related to stakeholders. It's good to keep in mind that these stakeholders are the ones that go for safety and security assessment. To limit this, for now you will be presented in Slido with the question 1. So if you have, please, in a parallel screen, you can answer the question. The question will be related to something that we will discuss in the coming slides, and later on then we will show the overall result. It's a multi-choice question, but with an option to enter additional feedback. These will happen more often, so then I'll inform you. So now question 1 is being raised. About the truck platooning, to limit the scope for the moment, we assume that it's an automation level which is currently closest to real-life deployment as a basis for the discussion, where the first truck in a platoon is driven manually by a human driver. It could be that this is supported by ADAS systems, for example, ACC or AEB, but in the basis it's driven manually, and the following trucks are fully automated and longitudinal control, so only in longitudinal control. But there is still a safety driver in each of these trucks that is responsible for keeping the truck in the lane. This automation level is similar to what is done for ensemble level A. We use this more as a start, but of course, as a basis, we are aware that we should look at higher levels of automation also, of course. But as a start, I think it's good because this is the closest to what we expect that will be deployed on the short term. And if we look at truck platooning, what's interesting, of course, is looking at what are the functional requirements. That's an essential step also in the method because this really determines which scenarios are relevant and which scenarios should be tested. So it's always very, very important to define the functional requirements based on the operational design domain, the object and event detection and response, and tactical maneuver behavior. Those are key components that determine the use case, and in this particular, of course, the truck platooning, but with that also are needed because it is needed to define which exact scenarios do you need and do you want to test. To give you just an example is if we look at this truck platooning especially at this moment, it's really we focus on highway, multi-lane with a normal road surface with very clear lane markings. This example is based on Europe, so we have white lane marks with specific things like also, for example, the maximum and the minimum speed that we defined. So here we say like longitudinal is in, lateral is out. The communication protocol, you could imagine that you define that. At the moment, as in this example, we didn't, but depending on the country, you can imagine that you fix a certain protocol. What's good to keep in mind is that HEADSTART is not prescribing a certain technology solution. We really focus on the assessment. So we will not say that one communication method or another technical solution should be implemented. We try to make a method that fits in with any of the solutions that's there. So we are not there to prescribe any kind of format or function or solution. That's good to keep in mind. And we always look at the whole system. If you look at the description, you also take into account things like weather, because you can imagine that you say, well, you can only use the function in certain weather conditions or exclude certain weather conditions. For example, snow. If your system cannot handle snow, you can control that, and then it doesn't make sense to also use snow in your test scenarios. So that's just as an example. When you look at what we just showed as an example, you already saw that we made some choices that were very much area or region related. You could also choose not to do that and keep it very open, but it at least shows that it is relevant. So also, if you look at what's happening internationally at the moment, you really see truck platooning being researched and actually also implemented in different regions, which all have their own way of implementing, but also pros and cons. We see it, for example, in Europe, but also the United States. There are several companies working on that. Also in Japan, I think Singapore is also working on it. So also other regions are doing this. This brings us actually to question number 1. So please answer the question in Slido where it is actually raised, but the question that we would ask you to answer is if you would agree with the statement below. So for truck platooning, a single brand systems for both US and EU will be implemented and will be the case in most of the occasions. Or is multi-brand systems, are they essential for both US and the EU? Or do you believe that multi-brand systems essential for the EU and a single brand systems more for the US? Or if you have another opinion, please feel free to use the D, and then under the open item you can answer provide your answer or your more detailed information. We would like to learn about how you feel about this. We know that this has been debated in several occasions, so it's just good to get your feedback on this. So also the second question now will be raised. So we will show you some more slides on truck platooning. As mentioned, the cooperative part is very, very important for truck platooning, because there is sharing of both operational and tactical data between multiple vehicles. You can imagine that for purely the driving, you need it. So to make sure that you can drive close, you need to share that information. But also, for example, to form a platoon, there needs to be extensive, but at least there needs to be quite some communication to make sure that you can join, that there is room to join, all these kind of things. So in that sense, it's both operational and tactical. But it's also very real time, especially if you're driving very closely. You need to have a very high update rate of the information because you both act or multiple trucks act on this information. So it's also very much related to safety. And as mentioned, indeed, the messages are not often or often not independent. They have a very clear relation. So one requests to join, and then of course this triggers a join response, and there's a whole interaction, and this response depends then on how many people or how many trucks are already in, and so it's a very interactive communication that's needed there. This already brings one topic that we would like to discuss with you and ask your feedback on is how should you approach this? Because in a way it are single trucks, but they are part of a bigger platoon. And the question then that we would like to raise to you is, do you believe, for this one we focus on the EU type approval, because we think that it might be different in other regions, is that for type approval, specific for truck platooning, do you believe that that should be done on a single vehicle level? So look at the individual truck and type approve that one, or do you believe that should be done on a full platoon level? Or do you believe that both on a single vehicle and a full platoon level is needed? Or if you have another opinion, please feel free to provide the specifics of that. Give you a few. Yes. So now, yeah, we had two questions about the truck platooning use case. So how do we see this, and how do we believe it's done? Now we can see, hopefully, the survey results. Okay, so this is, here you can see the interesting, people are still voting, I think. But it's interesting always to see. So in a way, I'm a bit surprised because the majority of the people voted that multi-brand systems are essential for both US and EU. Where I also hear a lot of voices that state that there is a real difference between the EU and the US. Where one needs the multi-brand and the other one needs the single brand. But I think this is a very valuable information. So thank you all for this one. We'll take this also on board, and thank you. So then related to question number 2. Here is a very nice split. So it's about let me see, half of the people indeed voted that if we look at type approval, you really need to have this done in Europe at least for both single vehicles, on single vehicle level and on a full platoon level. Where I think a quarter of the people believe that either single vehicle level or full platoon level is needed. But I think this is also very valuable information for us. To make sure that we cover both sides. So one of the feedback was from the survey 2 is both full platoon level and every vehicle around level. Okay, yeah, thank you for that that additional information. We'll also take that into account. Then I think we have some time for open questions. I would ask Jacco to.
Yes, this is Jacco. So looking at the incoming questions from the audience, at this time we do not have any further open questions that were raised. So in that sense, we can continue with the presentation as is. So just to mention again, if you have any questions, you can raise it also via the Q&A part of the Slido tool.
Yep.
And then we try to take some time to answer these questions. And again, also at the wrap-up part, we will have a moment for Q&A. So Okay, thank you. Continue.
Yep. Thank you, Jacco. So indeed, feel free to ask questions, but perhaps when we go more into the method section, it becomes more clear. Indeed, then looking at the method, because this was kind of what the use case is for this particular webinar and what it means. But you already see in the use case itself, there is already quite some discussion and differences possible. So if you look at the method, there were 3 main blocks. That's also how we structure our deliverables. By the way, the deliverable that was mentioned is due by July, and then somewhere in the second half of this year it will be published, because it will be a public deliverable, so it's also then available on the website. So the 3 main blocks are the scenario selection and allocation, so where from the database we select it and allocate it to the different types of testing. So the testing of the scenario is the 3rd block, and the 2nd block, and the 3rd block is the evaluation of the test results. Now, for each of the blocks, we have some slides and some information, and for each of the blocks, we also have a few questions. Oh, yeah. So question 3 will now be raised. So please all feel free to provide your information there and your answers. So when we look at the scenario database, because the basis of HEADSTART is that we are looking for a scenario-based assessment. So it's very important that the scenario database is a good representation of reality. Because at the moment, the scenario bases are still under development, or at least they need to become more mature. What we currently see is that many of the databases are based on currently recorded data, and they mainly contain the road layout, simply said the road layout, the actors that are on the road, and the conditions that the vehicles are driving in. What you currently see often missing are, which are actually also for that reason key enabling technologies for HEADSTART, are communication, positioning, and cybersecurity. Those components are currently often not in the databases. For example, if you look at communication, the communication signals are, for example, not in. So if you would like to do a join request for a truck platooning, there is no scenario database that covers this. You could argue, do we need it? But at least it's not in. The similar holds for positioning and also cybersecurity. As mentioned before by both Jacco and Alvaro, cybersecurity is a very particular one. That's also why in HEADSTART we see this as a different, almost key enabling technology, and that's why on Friday there will be a dedicated session to cover this. So related to this, we would like you to answer the question, like ultimately, for truck platooning in particular, do you believe that a scenario database should include communication parameters, positioning parameters, cybersecurity parameters, or others, or none of the above? For this answer, most answers or most questions have a single answer possibility, but here you can apply for multiple answers. And we are definitely also very interested if you believe that there are other missing parameters in the current databases, or perhaps many databases miss it. If you believe that there are certain parameters that are very, very important that are currently not being covered. Okay. So question 4 will now be presented to you. When we look into this scenario databases, a lot of different things can be in. So you could see a database that is representative and contains information of, for example, it contains but is also usable for different vehicle types, so passenger cars and trucks. But you can also imagine also motorbikes, but also it has information from, for example, pedestrian and cyclist or other types of vehicles. You can also imagine that it contains and is representative for various configurations or automation levels. So, for example, there is information for level 4 as a level 4 systems in it, but also the more simple ones could be used for, so the more ADAS driven, so the support driven systems. But also for us, of course, in very particular one, the platooning one is very interesting. And of course, you can also imagine that that your scenario database covers different regions. So as mentioned, the most common ones, I think, are Europe, United States, Japan. I think also China is now being more and more active in this area. Here you can see that there are many variables due to the different things that you would like the database to be used for. But the question that we would have for this is, do you think that if you look at the scenario database, that it's feasible and desirable to have a single world database, which then would cover all the different types and automation levels, and for that, because it's a world database, all regions? Or do you believe that it's, yes, you can have a world database, but it really will be for each of the vehicle types or automation levels? So, for example, there will be you need a dedicated database for, let's say, truck platooning? Or do you believe even that you can have a similar database, but then per region, but combined the vehicle types and automation levels? Or do you believe that it's so different that for each of the regions, you need a database, and then even for each of the vehicle types and automation levels, you need one? Or if you have another opinion, please let us know. So we're very interested to see to learn your feedback on this. What your opinion is about this scenario database. And if possible, you can also put under other what your reasoning is. If you, for example, choose B, if you have a certain reasoning why you choose B, it might be helpful to, if you have a strong statement about that, what the reason is that you needed, have chosen a certain answer. And as mentioned, if you have open questions, also please feel free to provide them, and Jacco will control them, and they will be raised when we have time and room for that. So yeah, so now we move into also the next question. So question 5 will be presented to you. The database we discussed. So from this database, what you would like to do is select the scenarios. And with selection, we have a two-step approach where we first filter the logical scenarios. So we have a scenario database where, based on a query from the ODD, I miss a D in that one. The OEDR and the tactical maneuver behavior, we can start selecting the scenarios from this database to select or filter out the relevant scenarios. So from a query, we only extract what we really need, so the relevant scenario. You can imagine that if we do truck platooning, scenarios where we will be driving 200 kilometers an hour are not relevant. But also if you say I am only allowed to drive in the Netherlands, then also 200 is not are not possible scenarios, because we have a speed limit of 130, and actually during the daytime we are even have a speed limit of 100. So that really restricts the scenarios that you would like or need to have a look at. So then you have a list of logical scenarios. If you then look at the logical scenarios, what is also very important is to take into account the parameter distributions. So the parameters that go with the different scenarios, to take them into account, and not just the parameter. For example, if we take a cut-in, the parameters that go with this cut-in, but also the distribution of this. We want to do that because we want to assess the relevance of the parameters. We do that based on the probability distribution. So how likely is it that a certain parameter has a certain value, but also in combination of different parameters. So we need to take into account that certain parameter combinations are not possible. And of course, we also need to take into account that certain parameters are, the combinations are not even possible if you combine them. So these, for example, show indeed a few of the parameter distributions. Of course, then it's very much depending on what exactly you would like to assess. You can make a selection where, for example, I can imagine that if you are an OEM and you want to evaluate how your system behaves in a certain area or in a under certain conditions, you can of course control and steer this, where I can imagine that for type approval you really would like to look into another area, and for example your NCAP, which is looking more into emergency cases, it's much more interesting to have a look at the corner cases where it really turns into dangerous situations where normally there is an accident, and then you would like to see how does the system control and handle this. Then this will be combined into concrete scenarios. So assess the relevance of the parameter distributions and then combine it to concrete scenarios. So in this concrete scenarios, it is really a completely fixed parameter set, which then gives test cases. Looking at this is also something which is quite a debate always, and what we would like your feedback on is with respect to this format of these concrete scenarios. So it's actually the test cases, so with single parameter values. What is your opinion about this? Do you think it's essential to have a worldwide format for this? So to describe the concrete scenarios, it's not about what's actually in it, but purely about the format of these scenarios. So do you believe it's essential to have a worldwide format? Or do you believe we can have multiple formats, but we need to control it for one per region? Or it's possible to have multiple formats within a region without a problem? Or if you have another opinion, please feel free to give it under option D. I would leave this for a few seconds, so you have some time to also, if you have would like to type something. Because I think the next slide is about. Oh no, we have a Nivo. Oh, sorry, we have another indeed. Sorry, I thought we already were at the overview side. So the last step of the the scenario selection and allocation. So from the database, we made a selection of the scenarios which we wanted to cover. But then it's very important to also look at allocation. And what do we mean with allocation? So with allocation, we mean which scenario with which parameters, so which test case do we allocate to which type of testing. Where within the HEADSTART project, we look at 3 different types of testing that can be allocated. So it's virtual testing, X in the loop testing, and proving ground testing, where X in the loop stands for, let's say, all hybrid shapes of between virtual and physical component testing. Of course, there are still a large possibilities. That's also why it's very important. What you see in the picture below is that based on the capabilities of the different types of testing, that needs to be taken into account when you do the allocation of the scenarios. You can imagine that if your proving ground doesn't have the capability to test certain things, then it doesn't make sense to allocate a scenario to that. So based on the capabilities of the different types of testing, they will be allocated to it. Also here we can also allocate, of course, a test case to multiple test methods to make sure that we have a similar behavior in all the different test methods. Because this is allocation, here you cannot really, we do not include this one-on-one to the field test. Later on we have the field test included as test. So now we can, yes, thank you, very good. So this is also an interesting one. So thank you for this. The feedback from the Q3, which was on the truck platooning, the databases. The majority of the people really believe that both communication and positioning parameters are essential, or need to be, well, are not essential, but ultimately will be needed to include it in the scenario database, especially when looking at truck platooning. Then there are about half of the people believe that cybersecurity parameters are very important and are also need to be included. And there are about 4 people that gave other missing parameters. So I'm curious to see what those are. The missing parameters are the dynamics, parameters, thinking indeed. I think it's meant the dynamics of the vehicle dynamics, but indeed that's also something that is included indeed, which in the current databases is perhaps less represented. I think that's a good one. Infrastructure elements, useful indeed. That's a very good one. I think that's to me that would be part of the communication, but definitely because we often look at it like the road and the actors, but it's definitely something to be specially aware of, that let's say traffic lights can be a communication beacon, but also other road furniture and infrastructural elements. Yes, indeed, that the infrastructure is a good one. The communication I2V to exploit as much information as possible to ensure safety. Yeah, I think that's also a very good one. Fail pass conditions. We have a separate selection. I think this is an interesting discussion because you could argue, does the fail pass condition need to be part of the scenario database? To our belief, the scenario database is a representation of what happens on the road, where it is less describing what is in a way good and bad, or not based on a pass or fail. The pass or fail, later on we'll also show that the pass and fail conditions come from a bit of different different origin in our setup. Could you jump quickly back, because I also wanted to discuss the last briefly. Yeah. The road parameters shouldn't be essential. Well, I think at least the current systems, they use the road parameters in a sense, being to me the interpretation of road parameters is, for example, the lining and other things like the undulation of the road and stuff like that, and the diameter of the turning. And I think they are essentially in a way that they describe how the vehicle, or they describe the environment the vehicle is driving in, and the vehicle reacts differently on that. And I think because the vehicle reacts differently on that, it should be part. And it's not that it's unknown. Okay, in that sense. Okay. Yeah, so the road parameters are presented, but it's not that it's indeed provided as an input to the system by definition. Okay, thank you. But it's a good one. We'll also take that into account. Yeah, you can. Yes. Next one. So the scenario database is okay. So it's a clear preference that there should be regional databases, which then can combine for all types and levels. That's it. Thank you. Yeah. Also valuable information. There's also some other. Let's see. The databases should be as complete as possible on all levels, but local expertise guidance should provide the right query to pick the different configurations for each deployment depending on local conditions. Yes, that's very good comment. That's actually also the query indeed, because you need to have a very good, for example, ODD. And based on this ODD, which can be very region dependent, you can make certain, need to be certain choices. Dynamic performances, indeed, and human factors. Human factors is actually a very interesting one. Yes, it is very important, and we also acknowledge that. Within the HEADSTART project, it was chosen to give it a minor attention, because there are several other European projects that have the human factors in as a main part. So within HEADSTART, it was chosen not to take it, to give that big place, but it was well spotted. It was actually something that we anticipated that one of the questions would be raised. But yeah, I think it's good to yeah. Thank you. There is one question from the audience. So. Oh, sorry. Yeah, sorry. We had still question number 5. Sorry, I thought it was already the last question. So with respect to the format for concrete scenarios, so yes, indeed, it is said like we can have multiple formats, but really per region we need one, which to me also makes sense. Yeah, I can imagine that it might be too challenging for them. Okay. Okay. Other different formats are possible as long as it's possible to convert one into the other. Yeah, that's also an option indeed. Yeah, formats are open and clear. Yes, that makes sense. Everything depends on the developer's target market. Yes. Yeah, I think that's also good. That's what we often hear, is that especially the OEMs that have vehicles in multiple regions, they really would like to see a single format, because for them it makes development easier. But indeed, if it can be guaranteed that the formats are easily exchangeable, then it could be an alternative option. But you really see that they are pushing for a single format worldwide. Thank you. So we got a question from Magnus Palm. Thank you. What challenges and in what situations have problems been identified related to communication and positioning for the use case? Also from previous, if we look at truck platooning, it's not the first project that is now being run. If we look at Ensemble, but it's also ongoing for quite a while in Europe, but also in the US. What we often see indeed is that because communication is so important, that you really need to ensure that if there is, for example, you start driving in a tunnel, you need to make sure that the communication is not lost, but also positioning is still able to handle that. That perhaps there is a drop in GPS, but the system should still be able to handle that. We know that communication and also positioning, it can sometimes fail. It's not 100% guarantee for many reasons. There also we would need, for that reason, we also look at cybersecurity. There could also be an attack that makes your communication or your positioning failing. And for that reason, it's very important to also take that into account. And then perhaps the system doesn't fully do it as you intend, but at least if it's done in a safe way, that's the most important thing. So thank you. Then we can go to the next one. Continue with the
presentation.
Yeah, with the presentation. Oh, I think you already get question 6 now presented. Can we go back to the presentation? Perfect. Thank you. So then looking at the different types of testing. So besides the 3 I already mentioned, we also have field testing. So we just gave a few small things. For each of the testing methods, we gave some pros and cons. You probably are all aware of the different types of testing. Virtual testing is very good to do a lot of different configurations easily, but also during development, it's ideal because you can change easily certain parameters of your system and see what a large set of scenarios have for effect. Of course, the model creation and validation is a rather expensive exercise. But we believe that virtual testing is an essential part of future assessment. Another one is the X in the loop based testing, where indeed you have the advantage of you can evaluate some critical components. Our method really looks at the full system, but often in the full system approach, you can evaluate some critical components. For example, what for truck platooning is very relevant is to evaluate the communication units. So use, for example, at the bottom right, you see there are 3 trucks. The 3 steering wheel on the right represent a truck, and they are communicating with each other and driving in a platoon in a virtual world. But a part of the components are in hardware and part of the components are in the virtual world. So some critical components we can there evaluate in a very controlled environment, but with very much variation in scenarios. The model creation and validation is expensive, takes time and money, of course. Here you need to pay special attention where there is interaction between the model and real parts. For example, in the bottom left, you see a driving simulator. As mentioned, we didn't include it in the full assessment, but it's part of the X in the loop. There, of course, it's very relevant to be aware that a part is in a model and the real part is the human. That, yeah, it's not exactly as it is in reality, but you need to be aware of that. Then a question related to X in the loop. Do you believe that X in the loop is an essential part of CAD assessment, where then in particular we look into to platooning? Yeah, so the answers could be yes, also in the future. So it will be always an essential part, or yes, at least for the coming years. No, or other, or if you have a special comment to this, please feel free to provide that here. So that, go to the next one. So yeah, also question 7 now. So the proving ground. Testing, of course, you have the advantage to have a full system testing possible, but it's still in a controlled and safe environment. However, there are some disadvantages. For example, systems that are geofenced, you need to really fool them, because test track is not part of the geofencing in general. This is especially, of course, for production vehicles a problem, but there are also sometimes limitations on communication and positioning, because it's of course a confined area. If you look at truck platooning, what we see is that especially for truck platooning, trucks already, but platooning in particular, you need really a lot of space, which is then of course on a test track quite a challenge. Also related to that is that infrastructure features, the big ones, so bridges, tunnels, but also undulated roads, they are not that much available on test tracks, and only in limited cases. And also V2I are only limited available. In the pictures you see the 4 different test tracks that we will have available within available in the projects to run test sessions on. So the RDW, IDIADA, ATC in Aldenhoven, and Asta Zero in Sweden. So those 3 were all in a very controlled environment. So that's also why we could allocate scenarios there. But we believe that field testing, so on the public road, is an essential part also of the assessment. Especially if we would look into type approval, for example, we believe that it will also be a part of it. How big? That's of course a very interesting question, but that's something to also be discussed. And what are the pros? So you can have multiple actor testing in a real environment. So for example, truck platooning, you can test that with multiple trucks, and then with real cars, with real other road users in it. You can do the geofencing testing, but also what you learn there you can use as feedback into the other configurations. That's something that also come back on the results. There are, however, some disadvantages, which I already mentioned, is like the limited control that you have over a scenario. Some scenario you can kind of control in a sense, for example, engaging, you can start the engagement. But for the rest, what happens and how it exactly is done, that's less under control. And of course, what also needs to be taken into account is, especially during development, but also assessment, it might require the allowance or an exemption to do this on the public road, which may be very, very challenging, depending on your system. So then question number 7, do you believe alternative ways of testing are needed? So besides the ones that we showed, in particular for truck platooning. Okay, yeah, here I think we mixed up a bit the answers, but please answer. If you have yes, then please do answer under D, what you believe are additional ways of testing that need to be also included. So in here, accidentally, the answers from the previous question are in. I'm not sure if that's also in the likely that's also in the Slido, but let's see. Then questions, the survey results. We could show the survey results. Thank you. So do you believe XL testing is an essential part? So the majority of the people believe that also in the future this is still needed. It's good to know. Only a smaller group believe that it's needed for the coming years, but in the further future that's not needed. So XL, to me, I read that XL then will disappear and that it will be virtual testing and physical testing, proving ground / public road testing. Thank you for this feedback. Then question 7, because there are no other. Do you believe that alternative ways of testing are needed? So also yes, in the future. That's good. Then it's interesting to know a third thing that's enough, and then it's interesting to know what are the other ones. So the ones that are believed are missing. Yes, so for specific functions and for HMI. So definitely HMI is definitely something that's where the testing, of course, you could execute some of the testing in one of the virtual, or virtual it's a bit more difficult, but especially that needs special attention. Yeah, I think that's a good one. Thank you for that. And then we can go to the next one. An open question, or do we?
This is Jacco. So we had one question, but I propose to skip that for now, considering the time. So let's continue with the presentation.
Yeah. Thank you. Oh, sorry. So now question 8 is being raised. So then we go into the evaluation section. So after all the testing is done, as it was actually mentioned before, the evaluation very much, of course, depends on, and that's also why you see a line from the right section where the driving function and the use cases are defined, a link to the, here it's called a pass-fail criteria, but in general the criteria, because you can also imagine that there are other criteria. It very much depends on the driving function and the use case, but of course also on, I call it here, the stakeholder, where you can imagine that the OEMs have a completely different way of evaluating than the type approval authorities. But we believe that the method itself can be used by all the different stakeholders. Perhaps they have different evaluation requirements, but in the end, the method itself will work. And I think that's also the power of the method, that it's a generic method that can be used on the different levels. And with that, you can relatively easily apply them for the different stakeholders. So during development, the OEM can use it, but then also when looking at type approval authorities, they can use the same approach. And looking at, especially for truck platooning, we already discussed this a bit, is that it's of course very important that there's a proper handling of the communication, and then in particular also of the communication V2X issues. In our deliverables, also in D22, we already listed a few of them, but think about things like signal loss, latency problems, things like that. And the same holds also for correct positioning of positioning, so that the system knows that the positioning is handled correctly, or if there's an issue with the positioning input, that also the vehicle knows how to handle that and handles that in a correct way. Because as mentioned, it can always happen that there is an issue with the incoming information, because it's an external source. Next one. So then question 8, do you see additional stakeholders besides the ones that For truck platooning, then we identify them as the OEMs, the tiers, and the type approval authorities. For a scenario-based safety assessment of truck platooning. So know if that you believe that are the only stakeholders, or if you believe that, well, there are some other important stakeholders. If you look at safety assessments for truck platooning, that we should take into account. It's good to also take them into account a bit more explicit. Then, oh yeah, question 9 will now be raised. Thank you. So, besides the pure evaluation, is the result good or bad or whatever? It's also very good to be aware that the evaluation is also gives variable information on the scenario database. So the logged data, the recorded data, can be used as an input there to further extend the scenario database. Especially because some vehicles, for example, truck platooning, if there's not that much information of platooning trucks, that can be then put into the database. And of course, it's also very interesting to know and take that into account, the results, if you do the scenario selection. So you can improve your scenario selection knowing the results of previous evaluations. With this, we also have a question. So those two we already indicated that it's additional value, but do you see additional areas of the usage of the results of the scenario-based CED assessment? So if there are any other cases where you believe that outcome is very valuable and can be used in other areas or other for other things. So I would this. So now we have a summary of the questions. Oh, now I'm not sure anymore. So now it's good to see, well, interesting to see what the people believe that are additional stakeholders. So there are, okay. Yes, industry best practices will apply since the state of the art will not already be implemented in legislation. It's a very good one indeed. Also fleet owners, driving community, and not only vehicle authorities but also road authorities. Yes, that's also a good one. Acceptance is essential, and that's only possible to include all stakeholders. True. That's where we are very aware of that. The question is a bit on for the safety assessment method itself. Those were the main stakeholders. But we fully agree that if you talk about acceptance of CED, there are much more stakeholders that are and play an essential role. In the transport companies, that's also a good one. Road safety associations, road users associations, and insurance companies. The police. Yes. Yeah. I think they're all good add-ons. Thank you. This one, do you see? No and yes. So additional areas. So then it's interesting to see what are the additional areas. Tolling. Not sure what's exactly meant with what area the results could be used to improve the virtual model compared to the proving ground. Yes, indeed, that's also a good one. The result indeed that they loop back into validation. That was not indeed didn't cover that yet. That's actually a good one indeed. It was not in the slides now, but of course the results are also there to validate and to further improve the virtual and also the Excel model. And infrastructure, that's actually also a good one to improve the infrastructure design and tolling. Okay, like that. Yeah, thank you. Go to the next one. Yes, so now you will already be raised with the final question, because now we are at the wrap up, which is actually more like it's less related to the assessment method, but it was more a general question, which to truck platooning, which we were just interesting to share it with you. What do you believe is the biggest challenge if you look at truck platooning to a worldwide implementation on a large scale? We already named some: type approval, liability, the viable business case, consumer acceptance. Those are all things that we at least once heard that's a challenge or other. We were just interesting to learn from you what you believe is the biggest challenge, just to get a feeling of where are the biggest challenge to get truck platooning implemented. So I'll the question will raise late after this slide. We will see the results, but we are getting at the end of the presentation and of the slides. So I think we had a very helpful contribution from the people. The questions that we raised gave both the multiple choice one, but definitely also the open questions gave a good idea of what's up in your mind and what do you believe are the critical things, and where you believe that the method that we are proposing should be further detailed or further applied.
Next slide will also have some results again from
the one from the
open question.
Yeah, and the slides, the voting results and recording will be shared just as a recap. And as mentioned, the final or all the feedback also from the last question is in the next slide, will be put into the 2.3 assessment methods that are applied to the use cases. So not just for truck platooning, but also for the other two use cases, so highway pilot and traffic jam chauffeur. A similar exercise is being done and put in deliverable 2.3. So then about the survey, question number 10. Curious to learn what the result was. An interesting one. So the biggest challenges, it's liability and a viable business case. That's about a bit less than a bit over a quarter of the people believe those are the two main ones. Consumer acceptance and type approval is a bit less, and then there are some others, which is interesting to learn that also several people put in. So security in case of an emergency maneuver, yes, indeed. I think that's also a very challenging thing, of course. Indeed, economical advantages or merits. I think that's also the viable business case. So in the end, someone needs to have an economical benefit of it. Otherwise, the development and also the exploitation of it will not make sense. A common solution between all the truck makers. That's a very good one. That's actually one of the reasons why the Ensemble project is being executed. So Ensemble project is the EU project, a multi-brand where all European truck manufacturers are involved in, where we want to have a multi-brand truck platooning solution. So that's definitely something that was already noted like a few years ago, and based on that, the European Union kind of pushed that would be implemented. So that's definitely something that's a challenge, but I believe that will be solved on the relatively short term, at least in Europe. Why consumers acceptance if traffic platooning is meant for commercial operators? In the end, there's always a consumer. Well, that's also a bit like you could question who is the consumer. But indeed, truck platooning itself is probably, that's also why it was crossed out in the earlier slides. At the moment, we don't believe that consumer organizations have a real say in this. On the other hand, if the complete audience don't want truck platooning on the public road, there's also a problem. Like if all the normal car drivers do not accept them and I don't know, boycott them, or of course they also need to be accepted in the public domain because they're driving on the public road. Okay, thank you. I think then we have time for some questions, or are we? Yes.
Yes, so we have two additional questions. So we are really getting at the end of the webinar. So if you could look at the first question where it's about truck platooning application, that it's technology transparent for also the communication technology, and if that will not impact the validation methods.
We believe, and at least that was the intention, is that our validation methodology is neutral. However, if you would go into more detail and really define the test itself, then yes, you will have to, let's say, choose, and there is a choice made. That's for sure. But the idea is that the method that we develop is neutral.
Exactly. I like to add to that. For instance, if you consider that communication is safety critical, it also makes sense that you have a redundant communication channel. So you will really have to take care of multiple technologies which you can assess at the same time. Okay, thank you. Then the other question is related to the stakeholders, that they need to acknowledge the validation method, not only for acceptance, but also for economic reasons like insurance. I think that's not really a question, but a statement.
Yeah, but we'll take that statement on board, indeed.
Okay, then looking at the time, we don't have, we cannot take additional questions. So we're really going to the end. So next slide, please. So we have the wrap-up part. We have the follow-up plans for HEADSTART. Well, you can all have a look at that. So the next HEADSTART session will be the validation of the use case, the traffic jam chauffeur. So that will be a session a bit similar like this session, but then it really will discuss the use case traffic jam chauffeur. And on Friday, there is a dedicated cybersecurity session that was already mentioned. And after that cybersecurity session, there will also be the wrap-up of the complete week and the lessons we learned from that week. And the last line on the slide is, well, that will be follow-up webinars related to the work done in HEADSTART. So that will be updated later. Could you go to the next slide? So that is already mentioned. What I want to do at least is thank all of you who joined this session. You really make a useful contribution. We really appreciate your feedback. So thank you for that. I also want to thank Alvaro for the introduction he did. He has already left the meeting. And I really want to thank Chef for his good way of presenting the webinar. And Ethico, thank you for hosting this session. So everybody, thank you. Thank you for your attention, your feedback, and we'll meet again in future times. So thank you.